Hey, Watcher here. And as you know, I just recently returned from a cruise where I was waiting and watching whilst floating on the great waters, and it was fantastic. I just had a marvelous time. Feel very blessed that somebody gave me the opportunity to enjoy that opportunity without having to pay for it. And so now I'm trying to get back in the saddle. This is the fourth installment uh, of the series I'm doing on the secret history of Mormonism, and in this one we will focus on the third period of Joseph Smith's ministry, which is between December 1834 and September of 1836. However, before we get into this, I thought you might be interested to know what kind of sparked this idea of doing this series. Uh, Quite some time ago, probably nearly a year ago, I was having a little email communication with a high-profile Latter-day Saint apologist, and in it he said, as the program chair for the John Whitmer Historical Association meeting in Independence, Missouri, which will be held in September of 2015, have you ever thought about presenting a paper explaining the things you have mentioned in your posts? Please consider it. We'd love to have your scholarship and views. And then he gave me the link to check out. So I thought, well, over the years I have submitted papers and I've always been rejected, and I found it hard to believe that they would accept a proposal from me, but I went ahead and created a proposal. And in the proposal summary, I said, have you struggled to reconcile how Joseph Smith could be the means of revealing so much profound truth and yet also be involved in so many bizarre activities that appear contrary to the teachings of Christ in the Bible and the very scriptures he brought forth? This presentation documents how several ancient prophecies amazingly explain and resolve this paradox. It also details how numerous Old Testament prophecies were secretly fulfilled by Joseph Smith. It uses obscure historical events as historical markers to differentiate 5 distinct eras within Joseph Smith's 15-year public ministry. It will reveal a cohesive chronological narrative previously hidden behind all the high-profile historical events and revelations which otherwise appear to be a perplexingly counterintuitive and disjointed narrative of a failed ministry to gather Israel and redeem Zion. Much of the content for the presentation will be taken from blog posts and a soon-to-be-released book. And then for the summary of topics, I put, number 1, my words cannot return void. They must be fulfilled. Interpretive keys and methodologies used in viewing the LDS restoration through the eyes of prophecy and uncovering the hidden narrative of Joseph Smith's 5-part public ministry. Number 2, if he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men. Major Old Testament prophecies that foretell of an intercessory intervention and acceptable atonement offering by a latter-day prophet like Moses that explains the inconsistencies between the Joseph Smith of the early Kirtland era and the Joseph Smith of the Nauvoo era. Number 3, and it shall come to pass that there shall be a great work in the land. The marvelous work and wonder did not begin during Joseph Smith's ministry. It is a future event which is about to begin. Number 4, Church of the Latter-day Saints, using the 4 name changes of the restored church to explain a subtle change in trajectory and the secret storyline behind commonly accepted historical narratives. Number 5, something new must be done for the salvation of the church. a disruptive interpretation of Christ's prophecy in 3 Nephi 16, explaining how the apostate quorum of the 12 apostles was to fulfill the prophecy by setting up foreign missions to begin grafting the house of Israel into the restored Gentile church. And number 6, 70 weeks are determined to finish the transgression, make an end of sins, make reconciliation for iniquity, seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy, reviewing 9 prophetic time sequences from the book of Daniel that match historic events and related timelines exactly to the day. Anyway, long story short, they denied the proposal like I kind of thought they would. But, just to show you how the Lord makes lemonade out of lemons, it was the exercise of submitting that proposal to that organization that actually got me thinking along the lines of how would I present this topic to someone, and it's because of that that I thought of the idea of creating this graphic, which several people have requested, by the way. Quite a few people have requested it, and I've sent it out. And once again, anyone that's interested in it, just shoot me off an email and I'll send it to you. But that's how this whole thing began. And this series was actually sparked by the invitation of a Latter-day Saint apologist who happens to be involved with a historical association that just barely finished their annual get-together in Missouri. It was a get-together that I wasn't involved in. They had everyone and their dog submitted proposals to this historical society. From what I can tell, virtually everyone got accepted except for me. And the main reason they gave is that I'm anonymous, and they said that that posed security risks for them, and their insurance wouldn't allow it, and yada yada yada. And frankly, in hindsight, I'm kind of glad they didn't accept it, because I've noticed with some of the LDS related historical societies, most of the people involved, both the presenters and the people that show up at those meetings year after year, most of them, in my opinion, have long since lost faith in the Latter-day Saint restoration. And what they're interested in is just kind of mulling over the oddity of Joseph Smith and Mormonism. And, they love digging into history and writing about it and commiserating with each other and enjoying their association with each other. But the vast majority of these people that write about LDS history are without faith, and they're only looking backwards. They're not looking forward. And the thing I love about history, for me, is that it has come alive, and it isn't just about the past. And that's another thing I want to quickly talk about here. And I'm sorry I'm taking so long getting into the main topic here, but there's just a few things I really want to talk about. I'm sure you have all noticed towards the end of the timeline here, projecting into the future, I make note of some interesting prophetic events that have recently taken place, such as September of 2001, when the Twin Towers fell, and then 7 years later, when we had the major financial crisis. And then I kind of imply, and I have some question marks here, I kind of imply that something might be taking place this September, which is now almost finished. And it's because, from what I can see, something major should have taken place in September of this year, 2015. And I am absolutely convinced that something major has taken place. Now, I was, speculating on a lot of different things that I thought might take place, and they included all sorts of things having to do with, perhaps a financial meltdown and a financial reset, and perhaps some towers going down, and a big long list of things. But one of the things that I think we've all had the opportunity to see coming, because it's been publicized for a long time, but it has to do with the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church coming to America and speaking before Congress and before the United Nations. And I want to just, I don't want to get too involved in this, because I'm going to have an entire presentation on this later on when we get to it in the series. But on the other hand, I want to just briefly mention it because prophecy is taking place before our very eyes, and I'm concerned that maybe some people aren't seeing it. So I want to just share a couple things with you. One of my favorite Catholic apologists, excuse me, is Michael Voris. I get a real kick out of him, and I'm going to play a little soundbite from a recent video that he did, and then I'll talk a little bit about it.
American capitalists don't like it. So it's funny when politically conservative Catholic bigot Ann Coulter reveals her true colors on the occasion of a papal visit and says what the Pope is saying about immigration and climate change and so forth proves why the Founding Fathers didn't really want Catholics involved in the public square. Forget for a moment about what Pope Francis is saying. That's not the point here right now anyway. The point is that there are various sectors of society. This time it's political conservatives who really believe deep down where it counts, right down there, that Catholics aren't really good Americans. The liberal progressives think the same thing, just for different reasons. They have the opposite worldview of conservatives, but each group, in their heart of hearts, secretly abhors Catholicism. This country has hated Catholicism since before the country was founded. It was illegal to be Catholic in 10 of the 13 original colonies, and in the remaining 3, it was no picnic. Winning a war of independence and establishing a new country may have changed the law, but it did nothing to change the underlying attitude that, as until Ann Coulter put it so correctly, American Catholics give up their Roman Catholicism and start becoming more American Catholic, which in a word is Protestant.
Unbelievable. Did you catch that? 10 of the 13 colonies made it illegal to be a Catholic. Michael Voris conveniently neglects to explain why it was illegal to be a Catholic. And what's really interesting is how forgetful we are about history and about the truth about Catholicism. The reason that many of the colonies made Catholicism illegal is that the doctrine of the Catholic Church is that the Pope represents God on earth, and that all authority and power is his, both spiritual and temporal. So the Pope who sits in the chair of Peter is over everything temporal and spiritual, and that all of the leaders in all other aspects of church and state have to be subject to and submissive to the Pope. Well, this obviously is contrary to the beliefs of a constitutional republic. And so, just by virtue of being a Catholic and believing what they do, basically represents treason. So, this is what was conveniently not mentioned by Michael Voris. The Book of Mormon makes it really clear who the Catholic Church is, what the Catholic Church is. It talks about the formation of a great church. And the angel said unto me, Behold, the formation of a church which is most abominable above all other churches, which slayeth the saints of God, yea, and tortureth them, and bindeth them down, and yoketh them with a yoke of iron, and bringeth them down into captivity. I mean, this is the history of the Catholic Church. They have killed countless Christians, tortured them. I mean, you can't get around it. It's history. The Book of Mormon claims that the devil is the founder of it. Bruce R. McConkie clearly stated this in his original book, Mormon Doctrine, and then he got chastised by President David O. McKay and had to alter it and water it down a little bit because it wasn't politically correct. It isn't that what he said wasn't true, it's that it wasn't politically correct. But I would suggest, if just in case you're not seeing what's currently happening, I would suggest that you read 1 Nephi chapter 13 and 14 really carefully, and then read the book of Revelation really carefully, because there's no question about who the great and abominable church of the devil is. And I'm not saying that it doesn't include all other churches. And again, I wish I had time to get into this in more detail right now, and I really don't. But I just want to encourage you to, if you aren't really familiar with Catholicism and what the objectives of the Vatican and the Jesuits are, you're missing out on watching history in the making. And not just history in the making, but prophecy in the making. So looking at the agenda of the Pope's visit, on Thursday, September 24th, he spoke in front of Congress, and then on the 25th, he spoke in front of the UN, and then later that day, he held a memorial service at Ground Zero, where the towers fell. And I would encourage you to study what he's saying, because it's really revealing, and it's really prophetic. But a couple of things that I noticed, these are the exact words right here in a speech that he made. I come, well, this is what the Pope recently said, I come in my own name and that of the entire Catholic community. I wish to express to you. Now, what an interesting statement to make. In my own name and that of the entire Catholic community, I wish to express to you. Here's a passage from the New Testament. I am, the Savior said, I am come in my Father's name, and ye receive me not. If another shall come in his own name, him ye will receive. This is a prophetic chastisement that at a future time the world will receive someone that comes in his own name. But here's what I really want to get to. The Pope said, I greet the heads of state and the heads of government present, as well as the ambassadors, diplomats, and political and technical officials accompanying them, the personnel of the United Nations engaging in this 70th session of the General Assembly. Then he goes on to acknowledge the United Nations is presently celebrating its 70th anniversary. Is that significant? Here's a little snippet from Jeremiah 25. And it shall come to pass when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity. Here's a little snippet from, I believe it's Jeremiah 29. After 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. Then shall ye call upon me. So, and ye shall go and pray unto me, and I will hearken unto you. And ye shall seek me and find me when ye shall search for me with all your heart. He's referring to, and keep in mind that there in the Old Testament prophets, they oftentimes are talking about historical issues that are taking place at that time, which are types of future events. So is this 70 years significant? Is it possible that at the 70th year of the United Nations, that might mark a significant time when the king of Babylon will be punished and the nation will be brought to judgment, and a gathering will take place, and people will be brought out of their captivity and gathered to certain places? Now, I don't claim to be a prophet. I'm just somebody who is watching. But I would suggest to you that prophecy is currently taking place. And I'm encouraging you to read all of the passages in the Book of Mormon and the Book of Revelation about the great church and about what ultimately takes place, and look at the events that are taking place around us. Okay, so a quick refresher from what we've already discussed. During the first 2 years, from approximately March of 1829 till June of 1831, the Preparatory Gospel was being sent forth. It represented a period of preliminary missionary work so that the Lord could accumulate enough priesthood holders to restore the office of high priest and the priesthood of Melchizedek to the earth. So during this first 2 years, people were being baptized into the church, but in my opinion, they were not receiving the full baptism of fire and the Holy Ghost. And what the Lord said during this period of time is that no one does good except those who are ready to receive the fullness of the gospel. Then we get to this next period, a 3.5-year period. It begins with this remarkable conference at the Isaac Morley farm, where the Lord names 23 of the priesthood holders. 22 of them were elders. One of them was an Aaronic priesthood holder. But 23 elders were called, according to the voice of God out of heaven through the prophet Joseph Smith, they were called to be high priests. And this began a 3.5-year period of time where the fullness of the gospel was actually on the earth. So during the first 2 years, the knowledge of the fullness of the gospel was on the earth via the Book of Mormon, which contained an explanation of what the fullness of the gospel was. And then the actual power of the fullness of the gospel touched down, and for 3.5 years, the saints really struggled to embrace the fullness, and they ultimately failed. And that brings us to this third period of time that we're going to briefly review at this time. Okay, so on December 5th, 1834, Joseph Smith receives a revelation, and it's not canonized, but it is published. And it's right there in the official history of the church. And the Lord says, "Verily condemnation resteth upon you who are appointed to lead my church and to be saviors of men, and also upon the church. and there must needs be a repentance and a reformation among you in all things. So I'm suggesting this brings the 3.5-year period to an end. And then the next historical milestone that I'm showing on the timeline comes from, takes place, it's mentioned in section 64, verses 21 through 25, where the Lord says, I, the Lord, will retain a stronghold in the land of Zion for the space of 5 years, in the which I will not overthrow the wicked, that thereby I may save some. And after that day, I, the Lord, will not hold any guilty that shall go with an open heart up to the land of Zion. For I, the Lord, require the hearts of the children of men. Behold, now it is called today until the coming of the Son of Man. And verily it is a day of sacrifice, and a day for the tithing of my people. For he that is tithed shall not be burned at his coming. Wherefore, if ye believe me, ye will labor while it is called today. Now this was given on September 11th of 1831. And I refer to it as the 5-year prophecy. It's letting the saints know that they have until September 11th, 1836, to establish Zion if they're going to. And it's promising that Kirtland will be a stronghold, a place of protection until that date. And then afterwards, it will not necessarily be a stronghold. And in a minute, we'll kind of review some historical events that took place leading up to and following that date, and it'll become quite apparent that the stronghold is removed. But let me just mention the use of the term day here. After that day. So the Lord is stating that there's going to be a change of day at this point of time. So prior to this point of time is one day, and following it is another day, which is why in the timeline I am calling this the day of the Gentile, and then between the secret vision behind the veil and the date we're talking about now, where the stronghold is taken away, this is a very important period of time, and this is a transition of days. And this becomes the day of the house of Israel, where the gospel of Abraham, the dispensation of the gospel of Abraham, was secretly ushered in during this time period. And so it's a different day. And that's really significant what's being said here, because it's during this day that the sacrifice is allowed. And when he speaks of the sacrifice, he's talking about the law of the gospel and the law of consecration. That's the sacrifice that the Lord is requiring of people. And he's letting them know that there's a certain time period during which the law of consecration is allowed, and then after that, during this next day, they're no longer allowed to practice the law of consecration. He tells them in a revelation that because of transgression, they're no longer allowed to live the laws of Zion, and they must now wait for a little season. And that's what we're in right now. We're in a little season where it isn't possible to live the law of consecration according to the way God has commanded it to be lived. And then there's going to be a new day when the dispensation of the fullness of times is ushered in. There will be a new day. And once again, the law of sacrifice will be a possibility. Now, between these two milestones, or in conjunction with these two milestones, I want to talk about some other very significant events. And by the way, when I When I got ready to publish my book, and I felt really strongly that I should hold off and do a peer review, it was for a number of reasons. One reason is I knew I needed some help with a grammar and punctuation correction. And by the way, I want to thank everyone that has participated in this project. I've gotten just an incredible response, and I have what I need now to correct the book and feel good about it in that respect. I also wanted to give everyone the opportunity to challenge all of my interpretations, and I've gotten some good challenges, and there are even a few that have caused me to provide greater clarity on some of those issues. But the third reason that I kind of wanted to hold off is I just had this feeling that there were some ahas that I hadn't had, some historical and prophetic ahas that I hadn't yet arrived at, and I was hoping I might get some help on that. And by darn, I have. While I was on the cruise, I got a remarkable email from a fellow in Scotland, and he pointed something out to me. He quoted, and I did a little blog on this, so you're probably all familiar with it, but he quotes Doctrine and Covenants 59, where the Lord says, "Thou shalt offer a sacrifice unto the Lord thy God in righteousness, even that of a broken heart and a contrite spirit. And that thou mayest more fully keep thyself unspotted from the world, thou shalt go to the house of prayer and offer up thy sacraments upon my holy day." And then he went on to explain that he believes this is the acceptable, this is a prophecy that the Lord's giving about how the acceptable offering by Joseph and Oliver would be offered up in the Kirtland temple. And I looked at that, and it absolutely blew my mind, because I had been poring over the scriptures, for 30 some odd years, looking for this key. And I've talked a lot about the significance of this date right here, April 3rd, 1836. I knew that was a very significant date, and normally when I refer to it, the way I characterize it in the book is, I talk about how it's this secret ushering in of the dispensation of the gospel of Abraham, which is true, and how that had to do with what Joseph Smith would later refer to as how something new would have to be done for the salvation of the church, which is true, and how it made possible for the prophecy of Christ to come true, where Joseph Smith would have the quorum of the 12 apostles take the knowledge of the gospel to the house of Israel. So, I didn't miss the total significance of this date, but I never, in the book, I never really identify it as the specific time and place where the intercessory atonement offering was made. And it just blew me away when I read this. At the time this revelation was given, this is just days after the conference at the Morley Farm, where they're called to go on a mission and preach the gospel on the way to the land of Zion, and then they get to the land of Zion and they receive this revelation. Well, there was no house of offering. What does he refer to it as? House of prayer. There was no house of prayer in existence at this time. This is clearly a prophecy of a future event. They were just barely beginning to realize that they were going to need to build a temple, to build a house of the Lord, to build a house of prayer. And it was, about 5 years off in the future. You have to wonder if some of the people at the time the revelation is given, if they're wondering what's being spoken of, because there was no house of prayer. Now, I had identified through the prophecies of Daniel the significance of the broken heart and the contrite spirit, and I actually showed a 2300-day time period between the time when the Lord mentions the need of offering a broken heart and a contrite spirit in section 20, uh, in the baptismal protocol. And of course, section 20, the historians admit they don't know the exact date that the content for section 20 actually is given. And it is through this amazing prophecy of Daniel that we can identify the actual date the section 20 was given. And then the 23 days ends on this date, April 3rd, 1836. And yet I hadn't really put it together, the significance of how the offering took place on that date. So here in section 110 is a snippet from what the Lord said. Behold, your sins are forgiven you. You are clean before me, therefore lift up your heads and rejoice. And so the Lord is accepting the house at this time, the house of prayer. But this is a literal fulfillment of prophecy, and it's really quite exciting. But this kind of creates a little bit of a problem for us, because the Lord had previously said, if you don't obey my commandments once I give them to you, I will withdraw my spirit and I will withhold blessings. And so we have to ask the question, how is it possible for an acceptable offering of a broken heart and a contrite spirit to be offered up right here, when just previously the Lord had pronounced that the church was under condemnation? And that brings up another historical event that I think is hugely significant, and I think it answers the question. And this happens, gosh, about a week, 1 week before the declaration that the church and the leaders of the church collectively are under condemnation. Joseph Smith writes in his diary, and I have a mistake there of one. It should say on the evening of the 29th of November, I united in prayer with Brother Oliver for the continuance of blessings. And I'm suggesting that he's saying of gospel blessings. And the title, I neglected to put it here, but the title of what he's saying is he referred to it as the Covenant of Tithing. So through the Covenant of Tithing, he united to receive the continuance of blessings. So, and the Lord obviously commanded him to do this. Joseph Smith foresaw that the collective church was going to fall under condemnation because they failed at the law of consecration, or in other words, the law of tithing. And he realized that he and Oliver were going to need to take things into their own hands as far as doing something that would enable them to continue on with gospel blessings so that this could take place. So November 29th, 1834, the covenant of tithing is entered into for the continuance of gospel blessings, which makes it possible for a period of time to go by and for the Kirtland temple to be physically completed, and then for Joseph and Oliver to offer up the acceptable offering of a broken heart and a contrite spirit, and to become clean before the Lord. Now, one question is, and this creates a bridge. This creates a bridge for them to get from this point to this point and to accomplish what they needed to. So how long was the continuance of blessings good for? You could argue that it ended with the acceptable offering in the Kirtland temple, or you could argue that it ended on September 11th, 1836, because this is the promise from the Lord, is that the stronghold would last until this period of time. And frankly, I can see it going either way. I don't know that the continuance of blessings is necessarily synonymous with leading up to when the stronghold is taken away. I honestly just don't know the answer to that. And that's why on the timeline, you'll notice that instead of showing one exact point, I'm really kind of showing two. I have a kind of a a period of time here, because it is not 100% clear to me what each of these dates ultimately means. Right here, we know that the blessing and the curse took place at the Kirtland temple right here. We know that the Lord had promised that Kirtland would remain a stronghold where the priesthood hedge of protection would continue until here, September. So we have approximately 6 months right here of trying to figure things out, and that's what I want to do next, is to kind of look, well, actually, before I even get into that, we're going to look at some major events that lead up to the taking away of the stronghold and then take place right after it. And it's really going to be kind of fascinating because you can actually see by the events of church history that the stronghold is taken away. But before I do that, there's one other point I really want to make. You know, we live in a really interesting period of time where right before the marvelous work and a wonder is to take place, many LDS people are experiencing a crisis of faith. You know, I've been kind of bouncing around the internet and looking at some blogs by people who claim to be believers in the restoration, who are just spewing forth hatred towards Joseph Smith, and all they can talk about, they're just consumed with this hatred towards Joseph Smith because of all of the evil things that he's done, and you know, a majority of their comment sections is taken up with this consuming hatred for Joseph Smith, and then you know, Mormon Stories, which is getting a huge amount of followers. You know, their latest interview is very typical of many of their other interviews, of people just you know, losing their faith in the restoration of the gospel because of things that Joseph Smith did. And you know, one of the mistakes that I think all these people make is they look at the questionable things that Joseph Smith did, and they just assume that that is representative of his entire ministry. And what I want to do, the exciting thing about this timeline and what this timeline shows, is it draws a huge line right here. And what I want to just point out is that everything prior to this date, at the end of this 3.5-year period, you know, as I look at the life of Joseph Smith up to the end of this 3.5-year period, and believe me, I've been searching through the history of the church for 3 decades now. I'm fairly familiar with Joseph Smith and his life. I can find precious little prior to this date here of any serious evil transgressions that he committed. And I'm going to recount for you, just to the top of my head, some of the things that come to mind, some of the things he did wrong. And one of them is way back in about 1829. The church was struggling financially, and he received and this is according to the testimony of David Whitmer, which I don't see why he would have lied about this. So I believe David Whitmer's testimony on this. David Whitmer tells a story about how the church was struggling. They were in debt. They needed money desperately. And Joseph Smith received a revelation indicating that there was somebody in Canada, and I'm going by memory. I apologize if I get some of the details wrong, and I'm going to go back after this and superimpose into here some of the details from David Whitmer, just that you can read, just in case I get it wrong. But the story goes that a revelation was received. Somebody in Canada would be willing to pay for the copyright on the Book of Mormon, and this would help the church with their financial problems. Well, Oliver Cowdery and others went on a journey because of this revelation, it indicated that they would be successful, and they were not successful. Frankly, I'm baffled at the very idea that they would even sell the copyright to the Book of Mormon. But anyway, Oliver Cowdery comes back rather dejected and befuddled, and he confronts Joseph Smith and says, now, what happened here? You received a revelation. You told us that we would find someone who would pay us money for the copyright. And Joseph Smith responded to him, according to David Whitmer, and said, some revelations are from God, some are from the devil, and some are from men. Now, you're not going to hear that in your gospel doctrine class, because the LDS Church only wants to provide faith-promoting history. But I absolutely love that account, because I believe I believe it was according to the providence of God that happened, and that Joseph Smith was deceived and got a revelation from the wrong source, because I believe that God wanted to make it obvious to the early founding fathers of Mormonism that Joseph Smith was not infallible. And for those of us that don't have that kind of a background of some of the things that happened in the history, it's kind of hard for us to comprehend how people like Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer could have eventually left the church, had issues with the way the church was being run, and questioned Joseph Smith, had a falling out with him, and left the church. But once you realize that that's one of the major events that was at the very beginning of the church, God was allowing people like Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer to realize that Joseph Smith was a fallible human being, and that he was susceptible to being deceived just like anybody else was. Now, I don't see that as something that makes Joseph Smith an evil person. But, as I'm looking at problems with Joseph Smith prior to 1834, that's one of the biggest ones I see. And again, to me, that's not a deal breaker. To me, that's a wonderful thing that the Lord allowed to happen to keep everyone on their toes. And as you know, there are 4 or 5 places in the Doctrine and Covenants after that where the Lord mentions that if Joseph Smith isn't careful and on his toes and maintaining his awareness, he could in fact fall. So that's one thing that comes to mind. There are other instances in history of the church that kind of make you wonder. Joseph Smith was a very physically fit and physically strong person in his youth. And in the early history of the church, there were some instances of people coming over to his home and insulting him. And, he beat a couple of them up. He kicked some of them out of his front door and right across the front yard and out of his gate. And, there were obviously times where he was impatient and he would get angry. There was another time where he got into a disagreement with his younger brother, and they ended up getting into a fist fight. And he felt terrible about this. I mean, his humanness showed up many times during these early years. Another one, if I'm going to be critical of Joseph Smith and make a list of red flags that shows, his humanness in the early years, there was an amazing event that took place during Zion's camp, where Joseph Smith had a huge personality conflict with a fellow by the name of Sylvester Smith. Now, Sylvester was not any close relationship to Joseph Smith, but he was a he was a very capable person with a significant background of experience, and he is well thought of by many people. But he and Joe Smith ended up getting into a pissing match with each other, and it seemed to start with a dog that someone had given to Joseph Smith that was annoying people, and I guess it was running free, and it spooked Sylvester Smith's horse, and Sylvester Smith yelled at Joseph and said, you'd better do something with your dog or I'm going to shoot it. And Joseph Smith responded and said, you shoot my dog and I'll beat the heck out of you. And this, I'm paraphrasing here. I'm going by memory. But there were some real hurt feelings between these two. And when they got back, after Zion's camp failed in redeeming Zion, Sylvester Smith actually brought this case before the High Council. This is the first known attempt that I'm aware of where somebody actually tried to actuate the policy within modern revelation for bringing the president of the church to a court trial. And the whole event was very humiliating to Joseph Smith. And Sylvester Smith, brought his testimony before the High Council of what Joseph Smith had done, and he was saying that Joseph Smith's actions were not appropriate of a member of the church, or particularly as the president of the church. He also brought witnesses. There were members of Zion's camp that came and testified in behalf of Sylvester Smith, agreeing that Joseph Smith was not acting very Christ-like. Again, this is all according to my memory right now. And interestingly, the High Council found in favor of Joseph Smith and actually ended up, I think, rebuking Sylvester Smith. I have to tell you, from the accounts I've read, I'm not convinced that Sylvester Smith, didn't have a legitimate grievance. But I think there's huge pressure on the High Council. I mean, what would they do if they were to discipline Joseph Smith, and how would that reflect on the church and on his leadership? I mean, it really opened up a can of worms. What is one of the most remarkable things about this story to me is the fact that Joseph Smith didn't try to get any retribution on Sylvester Smith for what he had done. Sylvester Smith didn't leave the church. As angry as he was at Joseph Smith, he realized it wasn't Joseph Smith's church. And he hung in there, and within a year, Joseph Smith receives a revelation calling Sylvester Smith to become a 70. And this was a very high and honorable position in the church. And Sylvester Smith accepts the calling. But it's a remarkable example of how all of these people, Joseph Smith included, were very human. And they had their own baggage. They had problems. They had personality differences with each other. And I love how Sylvester Smith hung in there and continued to labor with the church, because as much as he seemed to hate Joseph Smith as a person, he read the content of the revelations coming through Joseph Smith, and he gained a spiritual witness that God was in charge. And one of the things that this timeline, if you really understand the 5-part timeline that's taking place here and how it's all being directed by revelation, even when Joseph Smith is clearly out of the way later on, after this his December of 1834, when you can clearly see Joseph Smith doing really serious transgressions, even then God is giving some revelations. The point is, God is in charge. God is driving the bus. Joseph Smith is just a passenger in the bus. Joseph Smith is not pulling the strings. To make another analogy, if this is a chess game that's being played, Joseph Smith is not moving the pieces. People want you to think he is. Your anti-Mormons and your people going through a crisis of faith want you to believe that everything that's all these revelations coming from Joseph Smith are contrived by him. But they clearly aren't. And it is so, once you get in deep into the revelations, into the content, and you're matching up the history that's taking place, it becomes so evident that Joseph Smith is simply a pawn on the chessboard, and that God is moving the chess pieces. So, I challenge anybody to find a really serious transgression that Joseph Smith, other than having some personality conflicts and some, personality flaws, some human flaws, nothing serious ever took place with regard to Joseph Smith during the 3.5-year period that the fullness of the gospel was on the earth, or before it. I challenge anybody to demonstrate that. The closest I've seen anyone come is there's an LDS author out there who, without a shred of evidence, he tries to claim that Joseph Smith started teaching about polygamy, during this 3.5-year period of time. And the only reason he's doing that is he's projecting something that took place in Nauvoo, and because he believes that Section 132 is true, he's trying to reconcile things in his mind, I guess, and he's projecting it forward and trying to suggest that Joseph Smith must have received that revelation earlier. And I find it very difficult to understand how he rationalizes this, but to suggest that without a shred of credible historical evidence is really unfortunate, in my opinion. So anyway, I think Joseph Smith is pretty much squeaky clean up until 1834 as far as serious transgressions. What we're going to do now is what we're going to do now is we are going to focus on this period right here and just after it, and I'm going to just list off a few of the historical things that took place that kind of help you to see the trajectory of the church changing, and it helps you to see that the promised priesthood hedge of protection, the stronghold, is removed here, and Joseph Smith begins to do some pretty outrageous things from here on out. I think I'll address these by just reading a section out of the book titled A Pattern Emerges. In this chapter, a brief listing of historical events will be provided, showing a clear pattern of how the stronghold in Kirtland was being removed as events such as Parley Pratt's revelation that the gospel would be taken from the Gentiles. And by the way, I wish we had more time to cover this, but Parley P. Pratt had an amazing revelation where the Lord told him that the gospel was going to be taken from this Gentile nation and that the elders would go overseas, and that is literally what took place. Joseph Smith's affair with Fanny Alger, the uninspired treasure hunt to Salem, the false revelation to establish the Kirtland Safety Society, and other events not congruent with the fullness of the gospel began taking the church into a downward spiritual trajectory. Keep in mind that leading up to the dedicatory prayer and the solemn assembly that took place in March of 1836, Joseph Smith had promised that those that were pure in heart would see God, and that an endowment would be enjoyed that would enable the elders to go forth in power for the last time, sealing up the righteous and the wicked and gathering the elect to Zion. Keep also in mind the fact that the saints were struggling as they approached the temple ceremonies in March and April of 1836. According to the statements made by Wilford Woodruff in his diary on February 1836 and again on April 28 of 1836, the spirit of murmuring, complaining, and mutiny was being manifest among the saints. He noted that some of the leaders in high positions of responsibility were beginning to reject the leadership of Joseph Smith and were striving to overthrow his influence. So even though the priesthood hedge is in place, protecting the saints from outside sources, they begin to have problems from within. When addressing the quorum of the 12 apostles and attempting to prepare them for the upcoming endowment in the Kirtland temple, Joseph had exclaimed that their minds were so dark that Gabriel himself could not explain it to them. Among those that believed and supported the leadership of Joseph Smith, it was because of the expected endowment and final taking of the gospel to the world in power for the last time that many of the saints were perplexed when no missionary endeavor of such magnitude took place after the week of the solemn assembly and related endowments took place. Interestingly, during or directly after the ceremonial events of the Kirtland temple, Joseph Smith warned of an impending apostasy. At or near the close of the endowments, the prophet Joseph Smith addressed us. Among other things, he said, "Brethren, for some time Satan has not had power to tempt you. Some have thought that there would be no more temptation, but the opposite will come. And unless you draw near to the Lord, you will be overcome and apostatize." A few months later, 4 of the apostles were cut off from the church for apostasy, and the standing of 1 or 2 others was very doubtful. Numbers from other quorums also fell away and were cut off. For over a year, those events in the Kirtland temple, for over a year after those events in the Kirtland temple, there was no major missionary effort such as the one anticipated. Finally, 14 months after the anticipated missionary effort, on June 4th, 1837, just prior to the mass apostasy that would be created by the Kirtland Safety Society fiasco, Joseph Smith would announce to the bewildered saints who were trying to make sense of things that God revealed to me that something new must be done for the salvation of his church. That declaration was followed by the establishment of 4 missionaries by members of the Quorum of the 12, despite the fact that the quorum had been in an ongoing state of disunity and chaos ever since the Lord had pronounced the Quorum of the 12 to be under condemnation in November of 1835. And then I have a quote there. The Quorum of the 12 continued to struggle as recorded in section 112 of the Doctrine and Covenants, previously addressed in this chapter. It is a shocking dichotomy that the anticipated plan of sending the sanctified elders, or high priests, having Melchizedek priesthood authority to gather the elect for the last time, was replaced with a plan of sending an apostate quorum of apostles who were not yet converted. Joseph's new plan was fulfilling the prophecy of Jesus Christ in 3 Nephi 16. Now that the Gentiles had rejected the fullness of the gospel, the knowledge of the gospel was to be taken to the house of Israel. New converts from the house of Israel would begin pouring into Nauvoo within a matter of years. All right, a listing of significant historical events relating to the September 11, 1836 deadline, when the stronghold was to have been removed. At or near the close of the endowments in 1836, Joseph Smith warns the saints that Satan has not had power to tempt you. Some have thought that there would be no more temptation, but the opposite will come, and unless you draw near to the Lord, you will be overcome and apostatize. July 25th, 1836, Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Oliver Cowdery leave for Salem, Massachusetts to seek for hidden treasure. The trip was uninspired with regard to the treasure hunt, and the Lord referred to it as folly. That's the second major example I can see of Joseph Smith receiving a false revelation. But this, of course, is a few years after the historical milestone that I'm using to suggest that, prior to December of 1834, there were very few problems that I can see that Joseph Smith had. All right, July 1836, Parley P. Pratt receives a revelation from the Lord commanding him to go unto this people, the Gentiles, and cry unto them with a mighty voice that they repent, lest I smite them with a curse. For notwithstanding the present fruitfulness of the earth, there shall be a famine in the land, and not only a famine for bread, but a famine for the word of the Lord. I think it should say for hearing the word of the Lord. For I will call my servants out from their midst and send them to nations afar off. This is really quite remarkable that at the same period of time when Joseph Smith receives this secret vision with Oliver Cowdery, where the dispensation of the gospel of Abraham is ushered in, so that something new can be done for the church and so that the elders can be sent to foreign nations. At this same time, Parley Pratt receives his own revelation of the same thing. This was bone-chillingly congruent with Christ's prophecy in 3 Nephi 16. Now that the Gentiles had rejected the fullness of the gospel, the knowledge of the fullness of the gospel in the Book of Mormon would not be published among the would not be published among the house of Israel, while the Gentile church in America would languish in a doctrinal famine. I think I meant to say would now be published. Virtually every pure doctrine taught during the Restoration would eventually be altered or discarded. All right, we finally get to September 11th, 1836. Nothing of significance happened on that day, which in fact is significant because it was the appointed time for the redemption of Zion. It was the drop dead date when Zion needed to be redeemed. Joseph had revealed in a letter written in August of 1834 that September 11th, 1836 was the appointed time for the redemption of Zion. His declaration came from the 5-year prophecy contained in section 64 that Kirtland would no longer be a stronghold for the saints after September 11th, 1836. Now, I continue in the book here to give some other significant dates that really demonstrates how the stronghold was removed. But we will continue that in the next segment of this series. So I appreciate you listening and keep watching.